speaker this evening. Mr. Charles Coulombe was born where? But right here in Manhattan Island. So he returns home to join us this evening. He was born on the day JFK was elected President of the United States, November 8th, 1960. I think Marilyn Monroe was in the same hospital as you at the time when you were born.
She was, but she wasn't my mother despite the rumors.
He left the city not too long after his birth and lived in Westchester for a few years in the town of Mount Kisco, which is where I was born, the hospital there in Mount Kisco. But at the age of 6, he moved out to Hollywood. When he came of age, he had a short career as an actor and a stand-up comedian. But then in 1986, he wrote his first book, Every Man Today, called Rome. And for the 3 succeeding decades, has spent most of his time in that effort, articulating, our cherished Catholic faith and patrimony. He's written many books, articles, lectures. More recently, he's been dealing with the internet, and you can see the episodes he has with his publisher at Tumblr House, which are a lot of fun. And Charles's great personality and his joy really comes across, and it's a real boost to the morale to listen to Charles and have him speak about our cherished Catholic faith. But what he's perhaps most known for is his commentary on church history, especially American church history, and he's sort of weaning us all off of the Protestant colonial lens through which we view American history, and he gives us a Catholic lens by which to view the history of our own beloved country. Besides that, he's most known for being a great articulator and defender of the principles of monarchism. So he's a great political philosopher as well. He wrote his latest book is a biography of a great saint of our times, Blessed Karl of Austria, and we're very happy to have him join us to speak about his latest work and this great figure of our Catholic history. So thank you so much, very much.
Here's the book. It's my cheat sheet. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Father. Reverend Fathers, ladies and gentlemen, Frank Palmer Purcell. He's a separate thing all by himself. First and foremost, thank you very much for having me here this evening. I was, in fact, born on the Sainted Isle, and coming back to Manhattan is always quite a charge in the arm, especially after a month in LA, where I have to say it's felt like being in the movie On the Beach. If you don't know what that means, great. If you do, you know what I'm saying. Having said all of that, this is a very appropriate place to begin this tour, this book tour over the next 2 weeks. The reason is not just because I was born here, but because New York, like the United States as a whole, has a very particular relationship with the House of Habsburg. It's true. The first permanent settlement, European settlement in the United States, was St. Augustine, Florida. 1565, founded by Felipe II of the House of Habsburg. Between that year and 1836, there were other interactions, but an important thing happened in 1836. The Emperor Franz had a daughter, the Archduchess Leopoldina, who married the Emperor of Brazil. She died. In her honor, he named a missionary foundation, the Leopoldinen Stiftung, the Leopoldine Society, through which, from 1836 until 1914, the emperors of Austria dumped millions of dollars into the Church of the United States. And not just money. Windows, statues, vestments, sacred vessels, and personnel. Two of the best-known missionaries whom they educated at their expense and sent over here were Venerable Bishop Moraga in Michigan and St. John Nepomukhin Neumann, later to become Archbishop of Philadelphia. They were, shall we say, some of the greatest gifts the Habsburgs had for our country. This very church, I would not be surprised, may well have been, and you'll have to look, Father, into your archives, may very well have been the recipient of fundage from the Leopoldine Stiftung. Not least because it was a Redemptorist parish. The Redemptorists had a big, big place in the heart of the House of Habsburg. Why? The patron saint of Vienna is St. Clemens Maria Hofbauer, Redemptorist, who was, after he had to leave Warsaw, came to Vienna and, with the patronage of the emperor, became the center of a circle of scholars and writers and so forth, who did a great deal to revitalize the faith in Vienna in particular and in the empire as a whole. Remember that the Austrian church was not just recovering from the horrors of the Napoleonic Wars, but also Josephinism, the idea of subjecting the church to the state, introduced by the black sheep of all Habsburgs, Joseph II. We try not to talk about him in polite company, especially around Habsburgs. They don't appreciate it. But the truth is that the Redemptorist order in particular in this country did receive a good deal of their largesse, and I would be very, very interested to find out if any of it came here to Holy Redeemer. I would not be surprised. Also be interesting if they know to find out, as many Catholic churches did, including St. Matthew's in Washington, as to whether or not there was a requiem offered for Franz Joseph when he died in 1916. Remember, we were not at war with Austria in 1916. So, having said all of that, by way of preparation, I've got to give you more preparation. No, it's true, because when I was writing this book, I was faced with a real dilemma. Now, I'll tell you what it was. So much of what Carl and his family and his whole outlook were about are things that are completely foreign to us as 21st century Americans. So, how to put in enough background to make it more comprehensible without boring the reader out of his skull? And then believe me, when you're writing, that is something you should keep into account. You don't want to bore your audience too badly. So, what I ended up doing was putting the first part of the book into a series of introductory chapters. The first part I call The Inheritance. Now, the imperial idea is something that you must understand if you want to understand Carl. But what does that mean? When we Americans hear empire, we think of the British Empire, we think of Napoleon, and we usually identify empire with oppression. And one of the reasons why we're having kind of a problem today with our woke friends is that they simply use the word empire to describe anything they don't like. So if anybody is in academia, you'll have heard about traces of empire in the intersectionality between structures of power and post-structuralist discourse. It doesn't mean anything, it doesn't have to, but people get paid to generate it, so that's great. I wish I could get that kind of money, but never mind. So, put all that out of your head. Really, in the sense that we need to understand it, empire, as it developed in the classical world, beginning really with the Persians, was first and foremost a method of indirect rule. What does that mean? It means ruling people through their own institutions, not forcing them to become part of your own. And it's interesting that the empires we know of before the Persians, what they would do is they'd conquer a place and try to remake it in their own image. Kind of like we tried to do with Iraq and Afghanistan, but no, I didn't say that. Anyway, that really didn't work very well. And the result was a pile of ruins at Nineveh. The Persians came up with the idea of employing the local people, the local structure, to run itself. And that has been the hallmark of successful empire ever since. Eventually, as we know, The Persians were overcome by Alexander, who developed the idea further. Out of that came the whole idea of Hellenistic civilization. Alexander's empire broke up and in turn was replaced by the Romans. And it's really with the Romans that our version of the imperial idea starts. Because, as we know, Rome served a very important role, providentially speaking. Had our Lord been born earlier, it would have been very difficult for the Catholic faith to get out of Palestine. But because he was born when he was born, it's almost as though he were God and knew what he was doing. Isn't that strange? It's funny, you know, like that phrase, the Lord of history is not just an empty title. Anyway, because he was born when he was born, the Roman roads, the Roman legions, the Roman peace guaranteed the ability of the apostles to spread the faith from Syria to Britain, and ultimately from India to Ethiopia. So, with that, something else strange happened. And that was the Christianization of the empire. Constantine, who's usually looked at as the father of the Christian empire, and in a sense that's true, because he was the first major Christian emperor, and he did legalize this. But it was under Emperor Theodosius that the Catholic faith became the state church of the Roman Empire, and that the Roman machinery converted. From that time, several things happened. One was that, in a real sense, the Roman Empire was seen by its Christian subjects as sort of the temporal side of Christendom, just the way the church was the religious side. The two were seen as partners. The role of the state was to assist the church in the salvation of souls. And the role of the church was to invoke God's blessing on the empire and later monarchies, and also to approve the passing on of authority to Christian rulers. And from that period comes a very important symbol that goes on and on and on from that time, the double-headed eagle. The eagle has two heads. It looks east and west. It deals with church and state. There are a lot of other meanings. You can imagine, though, how terribly disappointed I was when I was a kid. I knew this stuff, thanks to my mom. And I heard that song by John Philip Sousa, Under the Double Eagle. And I thought, wow, that's like some sort of a tribute to the Habsburgs. No, it was a tribute to his brothers in the 33rd degree of the Freemasons. Can't have everything. Anyway, but it's also why the double eagle is the symbol of the Tsars of Russia. Because just as in time, the Holy Roman Emperors and the Habsburgs would claim the proprietorship of the Western Roman heritage, so too eventually the Tsars of Russia would claim that of the Eastern, the Byzantine spin-off, if you will. All right, so that's the imperial idea, which in and of itself was also considered, the Christian imperial idea, to be the epitome of the second concept one has to get down, and that is Catholic monarchy in general. Now, it's important to bear in mind that there is no textbook called A Guide to Catholic Monarchy and How It's Supposed to Work. Okay, that doesn't exist. You'll never find it, never will. But what you will see is what was accepted during the Middle Ages and before and after to a degree. A good source for understanding how it was supposed to work is a book called the Pontificale Romanum. What, I'm citing a liturgical book? I sure am. Because the Catholic rite of coronation really sums up in itself a great deal of what the church held as the ideal in governance. And as we'll see, the coronation comes up again later in the story. Now, it was seen too, Christian kingship was seen in a very particular light. As you may know, Christ celebrated the Last Supper with his disciples. Well, on that night, in a sense, he united the Davidic kingship to which he was heir, with the communio of the church. And from that time on, Catholic theologians saw Catholic kingship as being a participation in the kingship of Christ. And as a result, one of the major ceremonies at Catholic courts from that time until the 19th century was the foot washing at Maundy Thursday. Every Catholic monarch for most of our history made a big deal about Maundy Thursday. Spain, Portugal, England, Scotland, France, Naples, Jerusalem, Austria, Hungary, Poland. The foot washing was a big, big thing. Today, I'm sorry to tell you, the only remnant of it is in England. Yep, Maundy money, the Royal Maundy. That's all that's left. For you Italian fans out there, especially for the Neapolitans, you know who you are, the House of Savoy did the foot washing until the main line became extinct in 1831. They were replaced by the cadet branch of Carignano, who gave us Victor Emmanuel II, and the joys of the Risorgimento. And of course, millions of Italians coming over here later, but that's a whole other story. So, foot washing was tied up, again, symbolically, with the idea of what Catholic kingship, Catholic monarchy was supposed to be. Sacrificial leadership. The leader as servant. That's a very important thing. Just as in later times they would come to see Good Friday as the origin of Catholic chivalry. Greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friends. That's just as Maundy Thursday was seen as the origin of Catholic monarchy, Good Friday was seen as the origin of Catholic chivalry. Is this relevant to our story? Oh, sure it is, as you will see. Because these were the things that were in Karl's mind and that dominated his way of dealing with the world he encountered. The other thing that one should know is that, before we even get into him, there are two things. One is that the two greatest houses in Europe are the houses of Habsburg and Bourbon. Their histories are very, very intertwined. I can't go into the great details about them, but I do in the book, and they're important to understand because just as Karl was the heir to everything that the House of Habsburg represented, Zita, who was the Princess of Bourbon-Parma, represented what the Bourbons were. Kings of France, kings of Spain, kings of the two Sicilies, yes, I know you're here, and Dukes of Parma. Their marriage was one of three, perhaps, between those two houses that had great effects. Anne of Austria and Louis XIII, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, and lastly, Zita and Karl. One other point before we get into the major point, the Pietas Austriaca. Now, every royal house in Europe had a kind of piety that was particular to itself, the way religious orders do, the way countries and provinces do, particular patrons, particular prayers, particular devotional practices. With the Habsburgs, the so-called Pietas Austriaca was very heavy on the Eucharist, hence the emperor always marching in Corpus Christi processions. It was very heavy on the Passion, Marian devotion. St. Clement Maria Hofbauer had a lot to do with it, frankly, in its later forms. And the Sacred Heart. And these themes keep coming up again and again, as you'll see. All right, so that's the background. That is the atmosphere, the mental atmosphere, in which Karl and his wife lived. Now let's go to who they were. Karl was not supposed to be emperor. When he was born, there were a lot of people between him and the throne. First and foremost, Franz Josef had a son, Crown Prince Rudolf, who was married. He had a daughter who was married to a Belgian princess and could very easily have a son. If that weren't enough, Franz Josef's younger brother, Maximilian, of course, was killed in Mexico. But his next younger brother was the grandfather of Karl. He had two sons, and those two sons, the oldest was Franz Ferdinand, who at the time that Karl was born had not yet married, but could at any moment. And then Karl's father, Otto. So, Otto, the schönste Otto, handsome Otto, what a man. Everybody loved him. It was funny, it was jovial, it was the life of Vienna nightlife. It was also, how do I put this nicely, very much a ladies' man. He had a political marriage with a Saxon princess, Maria Josefa, who was his opposite. Very devout, very pious, very dull, very dour. They didn't get along very well, but they got along well enough to produce two children, one, the elder of whom was Karl. This too was an important part of his life, their unhappy marriage. But something peculiar occurred when Karl was 5 years old. His father was in the army. He was posted at the town of Sopron, which is on the border between Austria and Hungary now. It was in Hungary then, very deeply in the border. And they hired a priest to teach this on Latin and catechism and things like that. He was 5 years old. You know, the kind of things a 5-year-old are taught today in our schools. It's like we're so much smarter than the people who came before us because we like writing stuff, because we got like computers and everything. Anyhow, so it so happened that the teacher, the priest, had a friend who was a nun, an Ursuline nun. She was also a teacher. She ran the Ursuline convent school, but she had a sideline. She was a stigmatist, stigmatic. Yeah, just like that. Padre Pio, all that sort of thing. But she also had the gift of prophecy. So he tells his friend all about this kid, and she says, he will be emperor one day. And he is a reward for all that the House of Habsburg has done for God. But Satan will hate him and pursue him to the very end. So, you've got to get everyone together you know and start praying for it. And they did. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the birth of the Gebetsliga, the prayer league of the Emperor Karl. It's a very unique organization because most of these sorts of things come after the person is dead. You know, oh gosh, anybody you like, Dorothy Day, she's dead. People are devout, they love her, that's great. They form an organization to pursue her beatification. Same with Archbishop Sheen. Just thought I'd say that. I don't want to upset anyone uptown. But, well, no, I know the town I'm in. I got to be careful, you know. I don't want to be rubbed out. But seriously, those usually happen afterwards. But the Gebetsliga has been around since he was 5 years old. It prayed for him when he was a boy. It prayed for him when he was the heir to the throne. It prayed for him when he was emperor. Prayed for him when he went into exile. And then after he died, began to work for his beatification. And then now canonization. So that's a very unusual thing all by itself. But he grew up, and meanwhile, other things were happening. Crown Prince Rudolph died, very mysteriously, murder or suicide, at a place called Meierling. And I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that the affair at Meierling was truly the Kennedy assassination of the 19th century. Franz Josef, his father, said that in a fit of madness, he'd taken his life and that of his mistress. The Empress Zita, who had sources of information, I guess, always maintained that it was a murder. I myself have heard from the monks of the great abbey of Heiligenkreuz, where the bodies were sent, that when the body of Archduke Rudolph was received, all his fingers were broken. Kind of hard to blow your brains out with broken fingers, ladies and gentlemen. I don't suggest you try it to find out. Trust me on this one. So, however he died, and why ever he died, he was out of the picture, and all the succession moves a notch. Franz Ferdinand gets married, but he marries morganatically, the Countess Kotek. Now, I got to tell you that Franz Ferdinand, I didn't know him nearly as well when I began, what's the word? Researching, thank you. The brain goes, and I turned 60, so it's all over. But anyway, Franz Ferdinand, he married morganatically, he married for love. As I did my research about him, though, I found there was so much more to him. You know, you look at the pictures of him, he just looks like a mean guy in most of the pictures you'll see. Or you'll see all his trophies in various of his palaces, and they'll say he was a psychopathic killer of deer. Well, you know, they didn't have abortion then, so they had to do what they could. What a thing to say, attacking our rulership of today. I apologize deeply. But they were game hunters in those days. Even the presidents of France went on hunts. Nowadays, of course, our leaders don't hunt, and they're so much nicer. Yes, they really are. But in those days, they had to have some experience. They also don't go fight themselves either. They don't hunt, they don't go into the army, they just rule. Yeah. You bet they do. Anyhow, I digress. So, Franz Ferdinand was very devout. He was quite a devotee of the Sacred Heart. When he was murdered in 1914, he was up to, like, I think number 7 or 8 of the First Fridays. He died wearing a medal of the Sacred Heart, and he personally purchased and fitted out the Basilica of the Sacred Heart in Halle, in Tyrol. Unfortunately, he died before the dedication, so his nephew took his place. He was a very important figure in his nephew's life, however. His father was, as you can imagine, not really the best of guides in terms of either morals or policy. So his uncle took him in hand. And this is another interesting thing. Because of the morganatic marriage, Franz Ferdinand's own children could not inherit the throne. They're the great family of Hohenberg today. But he treated Karl like his own son. Imagine the greatness of soul. You know, Franz Ferdinand made his deal. I'll marry the woman I love, but the price is that my children will not inherit the throne. And that would have been so easy to have been bitter, to have treated his brother's sons like garbage. But no. And in return, Karl saw in the marriage of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie a happy marriage. And that made a huge impression on him. Well, so Franz Ferdinand's children are morganatic. And Otto dies early, 1905. He dies of syphilis. So, that's the end of the Archduke Otto. And here I have to make a point. The first point I'll make about why Karl is a good patron for our time and our days and ourselves. It may have escaped your notice, but there are a lot of families today that aren't in great shape. No, it's true. There are broken homes, people get divorced. Not really. There are children who have no idea what their parents are like, what they would be together. And then there are families who are just going through difficulties and the parents don't care for one another that much. Karl loved both his parents. He got on very well with both of them, even when they were living separately. More than that, he took the best from each of them. From his father, he got the easy manner, the charm, the quick jokes, and the wit, but not the promiscuity. From his mother, he got the really deep, deep devotion and piety, but not the dourness, not the dullness. So, in this case, in this way, if you or anybody you know come from a difficult family situation, pray to Kaiser Karl for help. I guarantee you he knows, he's been there. But we'll move along. That skill he had also helped him because I mentioned that Franz Ferdinand and Franz Joseph, the emperor, the great uncle, well, I did not mention, but Franz Joseph had big problems with Franz Ferdinand having a morganatic marriage. And it introduced a personal rift between them. But wait, there's more. There was a political rift because Franz Joseph had gone through all sorts of conniptions to keep the empire together, starting with coming to the throne in the midst of the revolution of 1848. All his going back and forth on different things had ended up in what was called the Ausgleich, the creation, the transformation of Austria, the Empire of Austria, into the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, two separate countries under one emperor. He'd had enough of constitutional tooling. He'd wanted it left alone. But Franz Ferdinand was quite aware that the subject peoples in Hungary were not happy. They were subjected to Magyarization. You know, a great myth is that Franz Ferdinand didn't like the Magyars. Not true. He didn't like the Magyar Liberal Party, And he didn't like the Tisas who ran her. But it's interesting, and it comes to the story a little bit later. It's interesting, the man who baptized his children and who was his own Hungarian tutor, Father Lanyi, well, I'll hold that story for a moment. Remember Father Lanyi, he comes back later. It's interesting to note, though, that when the question of the morganatic marriage came up, court bishop, and there again that requires a bit of explanation. In Catholic countries, the head of the ecclesiastical household of the sovereign was also very often the military archbishop, the same role. So the court bishop, as he was called in Austria, the Hochbischof, he opposed the morganatic marriage. It was the custom that he should baptize the children of the heir. Franz Ferdinand says, no, you're not doing it. Bring Father Lanyi back from Hungary. And so he baptized all of Franz Ferdinand's children. Keep that in mind for when he makes a return visit. All right. So what did Franz Ferdinand want to do politically? His uncle, Franz Joseph, the emperor, had Austria very tightly tied to Germany in terms of foreign alliance. And Franz Ferdinand preferred the idea of allying with Russia, Britain, possibly France. And he sort of conducted his own foreign policy. He also assembled a bunch of experts from all over the empire because he wanted to federate Austria-Hungary. Instead of being the two bodies, there'd be a federation. Well, his uncle did not like that idea. So you had these two centers of influence in Vienna. Karl went between the two of them. But instead of siding with either of them, he sympathized with both. He understood why his great uncle felt the way he did. But he agreed politically with his uncle. But I think that the skills he had acquired dealing with his two parents helped him deal with those two. And you know, a lot of historians have asked, how was he able to do that? I suspect, ladies and gentlemen, there's a very simple answer. And you will perhaps be expecting it in a story so far filled with politics and intrigue. He loved his uncle, and he loved his great uncle. Really that simple. But, moving along, as Karl got closer and closer to the throne, his education became more and more specialized. He ended up going to a Benedictine school in Vienna called the Schottenstift, which means the Scots cloister, the Schottenkloster. It wasn't founded by Scots, but by Irish, believe it or not. For all you Irish fans out there, you could be found in strange places like St. Gall, Bobbio in Italy, Regensburg, and New York, all over. Anyway, in the 900s, 10,000s, Irish monks went all over Europe. Anyhow, it was in one of their foundations that he was educated. Then he went into the military. He studied at the University of Prague. All that. He was a very, very capable cadet and consistently got good ratings as a peacetime officer. But when he was a teenager, something interesting happened, and it shows his character. He was asked to, as was the custom for Habsburg archdukes, to join the Order of the Golden Fleece, which is an order of chivalry. He would not do it until he had read their statute book to make sure he could live up to it. There was an itty-bitty problem with that. It was written in Old Burgundian French. So he required the help of a couple of experts to decipher it. But only after he'd read it did he consent to be made a Knight of the Golden Fleece. Now, why is this important? Why is this important? It's important because for Karl, there was no such thing as an empty ritual. A vow was a vow. A right was a right. And it was something you lived by or don't bother. All right. He's getting marriageable now. Well, who's he going to marry? The answer was very close. A playmate from his childhood. Princess Zita of Bourbon-Parma. Now, she was an interesting lady all in herself. One thing I didn't touch on is that in the early 19th century, there were a series of civil wars and other struggles in France, Spain, and Portugal between the older line of their respective royal families and the younger line. In France, the Legitimists versus the Orleanists. In Spain, the Carlistas versus the Isabelinos. And in Portugal, the Miguelistas versus whatever they call them, Liberales or whomever they were. But Don Miguel of Portugal was Princess Zita's grandfather, the father of his mother, or her mother, rather, father of her mother. Her father, as I say, was the last reigning Bourbon Duke of Parma, but she was very closely related to the older lines and knew them of the French and Spanish Bourbon. She was, in a sense, the epitome, as I said earlier, the epitome of Western Catholic monarchy, of Western Europe's Catholic monarchy, in the same sense that Karl was the epitome of Central Europe's. Theirs was quite an interesting match, and it was a love match. Franz Josef was overjoyed. At last, an heir who married a marriageable princess. So, one of the few times you'll ever see pictures of Franz Josef smiling is at their wedding. And that guy's just grinning ear to ear. You know, usually you see Franz Josef and he looks like a cough drops box, you know. But the wedding pictures, he's grinning ear to ear because this was absolutely the star of his hopes. But after the wedding, and this is the second important point with him for modern people, he told his wife, now we must help each other get to heaven. Because he saw marriage as a sacrament. I know it's a Catholic thing, but it was remember what I said about ceremonies? Were very, very important to him. As he went to attend the coronation of George V in England, his wife went to see St. Pius X in Rome to get his blessing, to get the Pope's blessing on the wedding. And Pius X said to her, "Ah, yes, your husband will be the emperor." And she said, "Well, actually, he's the heir to the next emperor." And St. Pius X said, "I don't know. Death, abdication, I've got to think about this." So, who knows? But it's an interesting story. St. Pius X was very fond of Karl, as were all the better-minded people who met him. Anyhow, time goes on a little bit, and we are now in June of 1914. A very strange thing happened. You remember Bishop Lanier, or Father Lanier, when we saw him last baptizing the kids. Well, eventually he became a bishop and was out in the town of Arad in what's now the Banat. One night, the bishop went to bed. And in his dream, he woke up, the way he always did. And he went downstairs. He saw the silver tray, that usually had letters on it when they were delivered, had a black bordered envelope with the archducal crest on it. So in the dream, he opened it up, pulled it out. Now, in cards of that sort in those days, you would have the writing on the one side and perhaps a black and white photograph here. In place of a black and white photograph, there was a sort of odd moving picture of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie being shot in an open car. And on the other side was written in the Archduke Franz Ferdinand's handwriting, "My dear Bishop Lanier, I'm very sorry to have to inform you that my wife and I have been murdered in Sarajevo this day. Please look after our children and pray for the repose of our souls. Your very own Franz." Well, he woke up, and then he was horrified, as you can imagine. He wrote down everything that he had dreamt, put it in a piece of paper, stuck it in an envelope, put it in his desk, pulled out his rosary, and began praying for them. And for the next 3 hours, that's what he did until his valet came to get him ready for the day. He offered Mass for them, went downstairs, was very happy to see that there was absolutely nothing on that silver platter. And the day went on. And then the news came from Sarajevo that the archducal couple had been murdered. So he races back upstairs, pulls out the letter, opens it up, reads it, and found a very strange thing. When he quoted the Archduke's lines, writing it down, he didn't remember doing this, he forged the signature, which was a very peculiar thing, since he was not in the habit of forging. Well, In any case, and this is a case, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, that is not only well documented, it's been debated endlessly as to what it could mean, but nevertheless, it happened. And of course, it opens up World War I. The death of Franz Ferdinand was an enormous loss to Austria-Hungary and Europe, not just because it kicked off the war, but because he had been the head of what was called the Peace Party. You'll never guess who his opponents were politically. Peace Party. War Party, yes. The War Party. So, what can I tell you, ladies and gentlemen? We've all been to American schools. What do we know? Anyway, so what's the opposite of peace? I don't know. Welfare. Anyhow, the thing is that the War Party consisted of, amongst other people, the Foreign Secretary. And believe me, if you're going to have a war party, you really don't want to have your Foreign Secretary be a member of it, but nevertheless. Leopold von Berchtold and the Chief of Staff, Konrad von Hötzendorf, both of whom, and I hate to shock you, Franz Ferdinand not only disagreed with, because he felt Austria-Hungary needed peace, not war, but he thought they were moronic incompetents. You know what? He was right. They were moronic incompetents. But unfortunately, with him gone, there was no one to stand in their way. Now, to put this into a bit of context for you, imagine if you will, I shouldn't say this when we've just had a wonderful Mexican meal, but if you could imagine the Vice President of the United States being assassinated by an assassin connected with the Mexican Secret Service in San Antonio, say, we might be upset, and we might have a word or two to say to Mexico. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the man who ordered his death, Franz Ferdinand's, not his own, was a fellow whose real name is unpronounceable to me because it's Serbian, but his code name was Apis. So if you look him up, A-P-I-S means B. He had masterminded the murder of his own Serbian king and queen back in 1903, so he had some experience in this kind of thing. You never want amateurs, you know. And he would later be executed by the Serbs themselves, 2 years later. But in the meantime, the Austrians were sure that the Serbian Secret Service was involved. The Serbians were kind of pretty much thought so. But bear in mind, this was not ordered by the Serbian government. Apis was very much a rogue. He and his colleagues were very much rogues within the Serbian apparatus. Nevertheless, there were elections coming up in November, and the Serbian government did not feel that they could look weak for the electorate. And so what happened? They dug in their heels on one request that the Austrians made, and then they sought the help of Russia. Well, from there on in, it was pretty dreary. Austria declares war on Serbia, Russia declares war on Austria, Germany declares war on Russia, and France declares war on Germany. What's really sad and pathetic is reading the correspondence of the Kaiser and the Tsar trying to avoid it. But you know, they no longer really ran their countries. As early as 1902, they'd gone on a cruise together, had a great time, and signed a treaty of alliance between Russia and Germany. And when they got back to their respective capitals, both of their governments turned it down. You gotta remember, ladies and gentlemen, that at that time, throughout Europe, there were war parties and peace parties. The peace parties felt that peace was a better idea than going to war, whatever the problems might be. But for the war party, and this was true in each country, there were various internal dissensions, socialism, all kinds of stuff going on. And the war party in each country thought that a foreign war would unite the country and end their internal divisions. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this turned out not to be so smart. Not at all. And it is important to remember, though, that they had no idea what kind of a war would be unleashed. They really didn't. There's an old joke that every army fights the last war. And for most of them, that was either the Crimean War or the Napoleonic War. Had they studied our Civil War more, they would have found things like trench warfare, aerial warfare, submarines, indiscriminate war against civilians, all of which we introduced in our late unpleasantness in the 1860s. And then add 50 years of technology. and then perhaps they might have had an idea of the horrors that they were going to go through. But they didn't. And the bands played, they marched off. Karl was not happy. He was a well-trained soldier, and as the events would prove, he was very brave. But he said only a madman looks forward to war. There were a lot of madmen, apparently. So off they went. Well, initially, his job was to go to each of the fronts and act as the eyes and ears of his great uncle, the emperor, who, how do I put this? He might not have felt like firing Konrad von Hötzendorf, but he didn't trust him. So, in each front, Romanian, Italian, Russian, Karl would show up. So they called him Karl the Sudden. And he became very beloved by the troops because he was very personally brave. And when eventually he started assuming commands at different times, he was always as effective as he could be in terms of succeeding with the mission, but he never wasted his men's lives. And he was up close and personal with the fighting. There's a very famous occasion. He was in Italy in the Trentino front, which was a horrible thing. They called it the White Hell. And one of the ways the Austrians and Italians would fight each other is they not shoot cannon directly at one another, but at the mountains above them, in hopes of causing avalanches. And believe me, they succeeded on both sides. This was pretty horrific stuff. But at any rate, so Karl is there in Tyrol on the Italian front, and there's a flash flood. And this sort of lame, wounded soldier, but looking after some horses, he gets taken away in the water. Karl jumps in after him and saved him. I mean, believe it or not, they even then, with shall we say, something of a very high idea of the way officers should behave, even then that was seen as rather memorable. So he really came to hate the war. He hadn't liked it from the beginning, but he really came to hate it. The other thing that's important to bear in mind too is that his great uncle was becoming increasingly weakened physically. And of course this would end up in his death. Another thing to point out is that if Kaiser Wilhelm II had little control of his country in 1914, over the following 2 years he lost it completely to the two leading German generals, Hindenburg and Ludendorff. So, what happens? His uncle dies in 1916. Now, he's got a problem presented to him by Prime Minister Tisza of Hungary, who says, you've got to be crowned King of Hungary or you can't rule Hungary. Because you see, it's the wearer of the crown of St. Stephen who rules, not simply the king by hereditary right. But of course, to do that, you've got to swear allegiance to our Constitution, which means you can forget about federalizing Hungary. Well, he took the oath and he was crowned king, apostolic king of Hungary. This was very important to him and his wife because she was crowned queen. And you've got to bear in mind, I touched on the coronation before, but in Catholic theology, coronation was a quasi-sacramental rite, almost an eighth sacrament, it's referred to. And it bound the monarchs to their people with bonds as tight as those of marriage or ordination. At least that was how Kaiser Karl and Kaiserin Zita saw it. What did this mean? It meant they could never abandon their people. And that would have terrible repercussions for them later, personally. So, moving along, we've got to pick up the pace. Moving along, he immediately tried to get Austria out of the war and to end the war. How did he do this? Well, fortunately, two of his brothers-in-law were serving in the Belgian army. He used them as go-betweens. He contacted the Allies. He kept Kaiser Wilhelm informed. But a terrible dynamic developed as the war proceeded. When the Allies were doing well, they weren't interested in peace. And the Kaiser, or the Germans, were. When the Germans were doing well, the Allies were interested in peace, but the Germans weren't. And as things went on and they became more dependent upon Germany militarily, he realized that if he annoyed the Germans enough, they would invade. People have often asked me during the questions and answers, so I'll do it now. Why didn't he just pull out of the war separately? Well, because that would have been the end of Austria. the Germans would have invaded straight away, and there was no way they could have resisted. At the very beginning of the war, he and his wife were walking along, and he said to her, the problem with allying with Germany is that it's like having an iron pot and a clay pot. As they bang together, the clay pot is smashed. Well, the first thing he faced when he became emperor, other than opening up the aborted peace talks, was his German allies came up with a bright idea. They had bright ideas, really bright ones. This one was going to bring the British to their knees. Indiscriminate submarine warfare. It's great. It'll work beautifully. It'll cut them off. They're an island. They're not going to be able to eat. The Irish won't know what's happening. Can we not bag on the Irish at least once? Okay? All right. I hate it when I do that. So, what should happen? But that he says, I don't think that's a good idea. It's immoral. And worse, or not as bad, it'll bring the United States into the war. And if the United States come into the war, we cannot win. Guess what? They poo-pooed him. Now, you don't know what you're talking about. You're a kid. Oh, and by the way, we're already doing it. Can you imagine? Ostensibly, the meeting was to get his approval. And then they inform him, but it's already done. So, he didn't think that was a good idea, and he was right. The United States did enter the war, but we declared war on Germany, not Austria. So, you might wonder, well, how did we end up, and why did we get into the war against Austria? Well, a few months later, the Austrians really smashed the Italians on the Caparello. They almost took Venice. They were surging southward. Well, Woodrow Wilson really wanted to reinforce the Italians. The problem was that we were neutral in that war. You see, you can't just rush troops, what we do now. But back in those days, there were things called declarations of war. You had something called the law, the Constitution. A long time ago, these are old concepts. You probably never heard of any of them, and I don't blame you. But nevertheless, that was the way it was back then with those people who didn't know how to abort. Anyway, can we not bag on our rulers? Anyway, so what should happen? But that he was able to find a group of people who had been on a boat that was torpedoed in the Adriatic or the Mediterranean, I forget which. The U-boat picked them up, dumped them in a neutral port, and then they came back to the States. Before Congress, before the Senate, they declared that they had been torpedoed by an Austrian U-boat. Well, one of the fellows said, yes, well, how did you know it was Austrian? Oh, they were talking Austrian. Well, three senators voted against the declaration of war. And the one of them, I don't remember which one, said, it is to our undying shame that we have declared war upon a country that has never done us any harm, based upon evidence that would not stand up in a court of law. But Mr. Wilson got what he wanted. As you'll see, Mr. Wilson always got what he wanted. But mind you, it was the least that could be done for him because he'd accepted a demotion from president of Princeton to president of the United States. This was, and this was a trauma that stayed with him for the rest of his political career. So, you can understand. Anyhow, so what happens then? Well, the war goes on. It gets worse and worse. Russia has their revolution. But the Germans come up with another bright idea. It's almost as good as the first. What we'll do, we've got in prison these two agitators, two communists. One's Russian, one's Italian. Catch this. We send the Italian to Italy to destabilize Italy, and then we send the Russian to Russia to knock them out of the war. Great idea, huh? Carl said, no, I don't think so. Firstly, it's an evil ideology that they represent, and it would be a terrible thing to do to the Italians and Russians. And secondly, it'll blow back on us. Boundaries aren't going to keep that stuff out. No. So the Italian was not sent to Italy, and the Russian did not go through Austrian territory. Instead, he went on a SEAL training to Finland, to Petrograd. And you know him very well, of course. He was that great darling of so many of our woke people, Vladimir Lenin. And as we know, the Russian Revolution, the second phase occurred, and delivered the gift that's kept on giving to this very day, as our Chinese brethren could tell you, to say nothing of our Cuban friends, and Vietnamese, and the oceans. Anyhow, eventually, it became obvious that as the blockade tightened, as Austria and Germany were starving, and above all, as Woodrow Wilson made it clear, there would be no peace until the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns were done away with. Well, the end came. Winston Churchill was not what you would call a astonishingly pro-German propagandist, but he was of the opinion that it was our insistence, ours by I mean the United States, our insistence that the Hohenzollerns and the Habsburgs be done away with, that brought Hitler to the fore and then opened up Central Europe to the Soviets. And I think it's an accurate charge. I really do believe that. It's interesting considering, well, we'll get there. So, I don't want to go through the whole process whereby Austria-Hungary fell to pieces. You can read about that. But I will say that in 1921, 100 years ago, by now the imperial family had been exiled. They were sitting in Switzerland in relative comfort. I say relative, but they were not doing badly. This was actually a very pleasant time for the Habsburg children. You see, the eldest, the Archduke Otto, whom I had the honor of knowing, was born in 1912. They would have 8 more, the 8th posthumously, during the war, during exile. And there's the third point with Karl and with his wife, patrons of fatherhood and motherhood. Because their children and their children's education was extremely important to them. And even when they lost everything and were forced to leave their homelands, what happened? Karl took up the teaching of the catechism to his children. And Otto would later say that although the exile and all that was a horrible thing to endure, it was when he got to know his father best. Because, of course, before, his father was emperor, and before that he was running back and forth to the fronts. He barely spent any time with him. So only got to know his dad very well in exile. That's kind of a sad thing, isn't it? But it's the way it was. So they were living quite comfortably and could have, they were young. As I say, another child coming. They could very easily have sat out in Switzerland the rest of 20th century history. Easiest thing in the world. But they had taken oaths. Hungary had undergone a very severe communist regime led by a man named Bela Kun. Didn't last long, but you remember Tisa, whom I mentioned earlier? Bela Kun executed him. So you see, careful what you wish for, you may get it. At any rate, the end of it came when the communists were overthrown, and a man who had dedicated himself, supposedly, to Karl's service, Admiral Horthy, who had been the last commander of the Austro-Hungarian Navy, was there's an old joke about that. Why a Hungarian admiral when they don't have a coast? Well, they did have one then. And he actually led the counter-revolutionaries that, with Romanian troops, overthrew the communist regime. And he entered Budapest on horseback. So there's an old joke about the admiral on horseback, but it sounds better in Magyar. Anyway, most things sound better in Magyar, I'm told. I don't speak it, so I can't say. Thing is that Horthy, as soon as he took over, swore to Karl that as soon as he would come back, he'd have his throne back. He was only the regent holding the place for him. But of course, the Entente were not interested in that. They weren't very happy in the idea of a Habsburg restoration, or for that matter, any kind of a Central European federation. What happened? Well, Aristide Briand was the Prime Minister of France, and he had dealt with Karl during the period of peace negotiations, and he'd gotten to know the measure of the man. So he communicated with Karl through the usual means, and declared, look, if you can retake your Hungarian throne, not only will I make sure that your neighbors stay quiet, because France, they were dependent on France in a lot of ways. I'll give you economic credits so you can get the Hungarian economy going again. You see, for him, it was not simply altruism. He was very much afraid one or both of two things would happen. There would be eventually a resurgent Germany that would dominate Central Europe, and Italy might become the dominant power in the Balkans, neither of which he was keen on. Whereas a revived Habsburg entity of some kind, allied with France, would ensure France's interests in Central Europe far better than Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Yugoslavia, and Romania could do. So, armed with these assurances, he made two attempts. The first was in March of 1921. That story, I won't go into detail, you can read about it, but it's like The Prisoner of Zenda, if you know that story. It was really exciting, and he did it on his own. You know, it was, I mentioned his personal bravery. Well, it really showed it then. He gets to Budapest. He tells Horthy, here I am, I'm all set. Horthy says, no, go home. So now he realized that Horthy was not going to keep his word. He and his wife came back for a second go-round in October of 1921. This true, again, I won't bother with the details, but this failed again through treachery. And by this time, the Allies were tired of any attempt on his part to retake his throne. And Briand had warned him, I'm behind you 100% if you succeed. If you fail, I don't know you. And that's exactly what happened. So what to do with the imperial couple? Would they abdicate their right to the throne? No, they refused. We're not doing it. Okay, fine, you don't have to, but you're not going to stay in Europe. And they sent them off to a little island called Madeira, way out in the Atlantic. Oh, there was one other little rule. While they were in Switzerland, although their properties in Austria had been seized by the, I don't want to say worthless scumbag, it sounds so unpleasant, but the government of Karl Renner, who would live to sell out his country 3 times, first by betraying his emperor, then by selling it out to the Nazis, and then by selling it out to the communists. Good thing he died when he did. He would have sold it out a 4th time if he could have found a buyer. But I digress. So, you go out to Madeira, and no one is allowed to send you anything. Well, they get to Madeira, they have no money, nothing. They can't even stay in the hotel they pitched up at. So a local Madeiran offers them a summer house. Well, it's a roof over their heads, right? Yeah. But the hills of Madeira in the winter are foggy and cold. And a summer house is not a fun place to be, especially if you can't afford sufficient food, medicine, or heating. And so Karl went into his last illness. Now, what was interesting about all of this, and I haven't really even touched on the prayer life of Emperor Karl, the fact that he never gave up going to Mass, the fact that there was always a consistent saying of the Rosary together, consecration to the Sacred Heart, all this sort of thing ran through their lives together, their family lives. And so it was. They didn't have anything much to speak of materially in Madeira, but they did have a chapel in the house. And even when he was sick, he was asked to be propped up so he could see the Blessed Sacrament. A couple of times he was very ill, and they didn't think, with coughing and all that, they didn't think that he could receive. When the time came, he was able to. And his treatment, remember there are no antibiotics in those days. So they did some pretty, we would consider rather barbarous things, cupping his back, hot, just disgusting stuff. Not fun. So he got weaker and weaker, and eventually it was obvious he was dying. And several strange things happened. All through his decline, but particularly on the last day of his life, he said, I am suffering so that my peoples might come back together. Second was that when it was pretty obvious he was going, the last few weeks he had kept his children from him because he didn't want them to catch what he had. But he told them to send in the oldest, the Archduke Otto. And when asked why, he said he needs to see how a Catholic and an emperor dies. Believe that for himself one day. So in he went, and he saw him. And it was a memory that never left Otto, not even down to the days that I knew him. And then he told his wife, as soon as I'm dead and buried, contact the King of Spain. I've talked to him, and he'll take care of you and the children as long as you need. She said, how can you? You know, he's on his deathbed. It's not like he has a phone. How could you have talked to the King of Spain? She thought it was some sort of delusion. He said, just do as I say. When I'm gone, call Alfonso. He died. He died blessing his enemies, died in the order of sanctity. And he was buried. Zita got in touch with King Alfonso XIII of Spain, who said, I will send a warship, the Santa Isabel, to pick you all up. Well, the Entente said, no, we're not letting them leave Madeira until they renounce the throne. And the king informed the British government that I am sending a warship to pick them up. And if you fire on it, you are at war with Spain. I hope we're clear on this point now. Now, that might not sound like much of a threat, considering that Spain was not a huge power in those days. But bear in mind that Britain had just backed down from a confrontation with the Turks. Bled white during the war, the British public would not have supported a war against Liechtenstein. So, the warship goes, it arrives in Madeira, picks them up, goes back to Madrid. Well, not Madrid, goes to the coast. They went by train. Zita gets together with the king and says, very grateful, thanks so much for doing this, but out of curiosity, why? Why even to the point of risking war? He said, well, it's a funny thing, that the day they told me that your husband was dying, I suddenly got the strongest impression that if I didn't take care of him, the same thing would happen to my own wife and children one day. So I resolved that if you called for me, I'd help you. So she told him what Carl had told her, and they both kind of rolled their eyes at each other, But then began 7 years in Spain, during which time she began alone the education and care of her children. And this would continue later when they moved from Spain to Belgium. In 1940, Belgium was invaded, the family has to flee again. And interestingly enough, Otto was in Berlin when Hitler took over. He had read Mein Kampf, and one thing that's not well understood is how much Hitler hated the Habsburgs. He hated them. And he hated Karl in particular, because one night when he was a poor failed artist, he was working a drudgery job in a hotel, and the Habsburgs were having a reception, and Karl got out of a coach, and he epitomized everything Hitler hated. Or so he said. Otto knew that. So, unlike a lot of other people, he knew that this man Hitler would be a problem. He goes to Germany, he makes contact with a lot of members of the anti-Hitler crowd, gathered a lot of information, leaves the country the minute Hitler becomes chancellor, and delivers all of the material that he had gathered to the American ambassador in France, Mr. Bullitt. He in turn sent it on to FDR. FDR looked at it, was amazed, and said, if you ever need a place to stay, come to the States. So, 1940, the family flee Belgium. They go down through France. And it was a hair-raising. I wish I could tell you the whole story in detail. It's in the book, but it's really hair-raising stuff. Eventually, they came to the United States. And then the story goes on and on from there. I won't bore you with it. I'll just say that Zita would live until 1989. And much to everyone's surprise, she had an imperial funeral in Vienna. It was an amazing event. I remember it well. I wasn't there, but I saw it on TV. And that year, as we know, the Iron Curtain fell. But a couple of interesting points, and then we'll get to questions and answers. Interesting points are these, to me anyway. All his life, Karl had to deal with detraction, slander, and calumny. Betrayal from people that he had every right to trust. but he never became hateful himself. Never. When he died, as I say, he died saying he was dying that his peoples might come back together. And when you look at him and you look at his wife, you are struck by a couple who weren't simply devoted to each other and to their children, but to their peoples. And this is an important point because, you see, they represented a kind of leadership with which we are not familiar today. That is sacrificial leadership that puts its subjects ahead of itself. We are not used to people who think that it's their duty to die for us if it's necessary. We're used to leaders who are happy to have us die for them, of course. That's what it means, right? But we're not used to this. We may not be exposed to that kind of leadership today, but we can certainly pray for it. And they would be top intercessors for that kind of prayer. But having said all of that about their enemies, I'll say one last thing about their allies, the people who were devoted to them. There were a lot. Rarely in positions of power, but there were a lot. One of them was a young Czech army officer called Jan Masaryk. Now, he served the emperor until the last day of the war and remained devoted first to him and then his memory until he died. But Jan Masaryk had a strange father named Tamas Masaryk, who was the first president of Czechoslovakia and a noted enemy of the Habsburgs. Well, one day when he was president of Czechoslovakia, sitting in Prague Castle, he told his son Jan, they had a big diplomatic party going on. Jan was a very noted pianist in addition to having been an army officer. So he asked his son to play the piano for the guests. He said, "All right, father, I'll be very happy to." He played the imperial anthem. It's kind of a shock. But there was another interesting fellow in a long, long catalog of these sorts of people. There's a young Polish non-commissioned officer by the name of Wojtyła. And after the war, he named his boy Karol, Charles, after his emperor. Many years later, that Karol Wojtyła would grow up to become St. John Paul II. And when he first met Zita, after he became Pope, he said, "It is a great honor to at last meet my empress." But here's the funny thing. He beatified Karl, so whom he was named after. It is the first example in history, to my knowledge, of somebody creating their own patron saint. I've just never heard of that happening any other time. But there it was. So the other, I should say this, and then we'll jump. Last point. I feel like Coulombe, he'd always. One more thing. I should make a point about the cultus of Karl. His very first miracle took place in Brazil in the 50s. I mean, not the first miracle, there have been a lot, but I mean the first that was authorized, proved, etc. Went through the whole process. It was a Brazilian nun named Sister Mary Zita. And when it was approved and they told the Empress about it, she said, "Once again, he's thinking of me." The second was after his beatification, a Protestant lady in Orlando, Florida, that great bastion of something or other. But she was dying of cancer. She had a friend who'd been to the beatification and got the beatification prayers and passed them on. And she prayed for a healing. She got it. She recovered. And that is the second miracle that's been approved. But the question remains, it's easy to see why he's popular in Central Europe. We can see that. It's easy to see why he's popular in Brazil and Mexico, because the House of Habsburg has had connections there. And of course, there was the miracle in Brazil. But why here in the United States? 17 shrines, ladies and gentlemen, across this great nation of ours, despite the fact that we were at war with them. Why is it? My suspicion is that he represents everything we need in leadership, in the conduct of military affairs, in family life, in cultural life. I mean, he and his wife, who's a servant of God, her cause has been introduced. And interestingly enough, his feast is not his death day, which is April 1st. No fool, it's April 1st. October 21st is the day of his marriage. That's his feast. And I knew when I heard it that her cause would be introduced, because one day, I have no doubt, they will have a joint feast day, their wedding day. So all these things on every single level are things that we Americans need very badly. And what's great about this, and now I bring my remarks to a conclusion, what's great about this is that Carl and Zita are not only great examples to look up to and to try to follow, which they are. We can pray for their intercession. We can get to know them. They're not simply dead figures in a book. They're not even Aragorn and Arwen. And if you pray to Aragorn and Arwen, ladies and gentlemen, I will question your sanity, much as I love Lord of the Rings. They're real people and continue to be. And they are people who dealt with the same horrors, whose effects we're dealing with. And this is my last point. You see, you look at their lives and you could say, well, they were tragic. No, they won heaven. The tragedy is ours. Because they did not succeed, we are left with the results. And horrible results they are. If at any time they had succeeded in what they were attempting to do, the history of the world, and so our present, would have been changed in a much better way. So, one thing they did not do was give in to disappointment or to fear. They pressed on, and with every weapon they had, even if it was just their lives at the end, they fought. And so, ladies and gentlemen, must we. Let's follow their example. Let us never give in. Let us never lose heart. Let us never lose hope. And let us remember that no matter what our disappointments or our victories this side of the grave, they pale in comparison to what awaits us if we remain loyal and we follow their example. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate it. Standing ovations are never rejected, I assure you. And you hear a speaker say, no standing ovation. He's lying. All right, so now, do we have any questions, comments, offers of cash, more importantly? Yes, sir.
Aside from belonging to the Royal Society, I belong to the Society of King Charles and Margaret. I'm just wondering if you see any logic in that, because when I think about Carl, I think of Charles.
Very good question, sir. The question is there any connection, so to speak, between the Society of King Charles the Martyr, which is an Anglican society dedicated to the veneration of Charles I of England, the other Charles I, and this Charles I? And the answer is, oh yeah. The reason why you see a connection, sir, is simply because there's so much that if you said it about the one, you can say it about the other. An example of family life, in love with their wives, solicitous of their children, willing to sacrifice their lives for the greater good. But wait, there's more. In the case of Charles I, he had several things going against him, in the sense that his life could have been spared if he were willing to consent to the abolition of bishops in England. But more than that, what's often forgotten is that one of the things brought up against his trial were his negotiations for reunion with Rome. People don't realize it. And the third point that's also important, I think, in that area, and I just found this out recently. When he was imprisoned, Charles I made a vow, not unlike Louis XVI's vow to the Sacred Heart, the same position, that if he was restored to his crown, he would return to the church the abbeys that were in Crown property, not the ones that weren't, but the abbeys that were still owned by the Crown, who would return to the church and reestablish monasteries. That's, as I say, a recent discovery on my part, but I was quite amazed when I read it. In the Ordinariate, where veneration, not exactly veneration of Charles I, but shall we say prayers for his veneration, as it were, are permitted. That is, that he get his miracles, etc. There's also a good deal of devotion to Emperor Charles for the same reason. They see the connection. One of the shrines is at the Ordinariate Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Arlington, Texas. So what you see is absolutely correct. The two Charleses have a lot in common. So, in fact, you'll be amused to know that I spoke about just that last week at the Society of King Charles the Martyr chapter at the Ordinariate Church in Orange County, California. Yeah.
That wasn't the annual.
No, the AGM? No, sir.
Right.
I have a question.
All right.
Mr. Coulombe.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your excellent talk and getting us to know what's involved. My question is a two-part question. Can you tell us the status of the servant of God, the status of Peter? And secondly, is there any chance that the descendants of Paul and Otto would be in some kind of a grassroots movement for the restoration of the theocracy of the royal empire?
Well, those are two good questions. Now, see, if I were a proper bureaucrat, I'd say those are two good questions, dance around them and answer something else, but I won't do that. The first question, the status of Emperor Sita's cause, it's still a cause. The Society of Friends of the Emperor Sita, the cause was opened in the Diocese of Le Mans in France. The reason for that is that she was an oblate, a Benedictine oblate of the nuns' monastery at Solent. That's why they moved it there. They're the usual thing, as with Charles I. They're putting out prayer cards. They're gathering stories, etc. The life is being prepared. There's a lot you have to go through, but the cause has been introduced. They're looking for miracles, and please God, they'll get them. That's the first one. And you can look her up, by the way, the Debates League is online. It's got a very robust presence, both the American branch and the Austrian branch. The Association of Friends of Empress Zita also has a good presence online. So you can see all sorts of prayers for and to and with her and also with them. The second question is a very important one, in my humble opinion. Firstly, it's important to bear in mind that royals always have one hand behind their back when it comes to restorations. Why is that? Because they want, if they want the throne, they want to be ruler of all their people, not the head of the party. But that's, you see there's a problem there already. Because of course, to bring about a restoration, you need a party to do something. So you've got an inherent difficulty. And it is interesting to note that of the three most successful restorations I know of, England with Charles II, France with Louis XVIII, and Spain with Juan Carlos, each of these restorations were brought about not by the monarch himself, but by outside events. Because that, what I've just described to you about, you want to rule the whole country, you want to be father of all your people, but you've got to somehow be head of a party to accomplish it. That's a catch-22. In each of those three cases, an unexpected bolt from the blue broke that catch-22. So, let's look at Central Europe for a moment. We have Hungary, Czechia, Poland, Croatia, Slovenia, Slovakia. These are countries that, in our enlightened Western view, because we're so wonderful and stuff, hands covered with blood as they are of infants, we consider them retrograde and want to smack them around, but good. At least our governments do. And since we're democracies, our governments represent us individually. So, we're doing everything we can to force them to conform to our ways. From the rainbow flag to free abortion on every street corner. Not that we have free abortion on every street corner, not yet. There may be a few we haven't hit yet. But in response, the countries of Central Europe appear to be pulling together somewhat. I had this conversation with a member of the audience earlier today. Obviously, the best way to both counter our Western insanity and dear old Uncle Vladimir in the East is for Central Europe to pull together. But those are all negative. Those are all negative elements. You need something positive to hold a nation of nations together. And that is where I suspect that one way or the other, the Habsburg inheritance will indeed be invoked. And I can't forget that Kaiser Karl said in his dying day, I am suffering that my peoples might come back together. So, the answer is maybe. Certainly, let's put it this way, it's the best possible outcome. That I think better. Whether or not it will come to pass, ask me in 50 years. Then we'll find out. All right, ladies and gentlemen, yes, sir.
Shortly after Blessed Charles' beatification in 2004, an article appeared in the New York Times criticizing him,
Of course.
lying to his German allies over peace negotiations. What do you make of those claims, and do you believe them?
Well, of course I believe whatever the New York Times say. Oh, yes! The New York Times, the journal of stupiditas. And you know what we say in Latin? Stupiditas omnia vincit! But that's our national motto. But no, seriously, the New York Slimes, as a rag, is, no. Firstly, he did not, quote unquote, lie to his German allies. And you know, this is great. The New York Times worrying about the sensibilities of Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Oh, gee willikers. I've never heard of the Times getting upset. Oh, the poor Germans. You know, you can tell when someone's a real hypocrite when he starts reaching for stuff that you know he hates. You know what I'm saying? Whenever you hear me going on about, oh, but what if it damages the abortion industry? Charles, you're lying through your teeth. I don't know how, but you are. Anyway, it is true that he didn't inform Ludendorff and Hindenburg. Yes. He did inform Kaiser Wilhelm and reminded him when this came up again and Ludendorff and Hindenburg started to jump up and down. Ludendorff, of course, would help bring Hitler to power. I'm sure the Times were very supportive of Ludendorff then too. But, well, you don't know, I don't know. But the truth is that he reminded Wilhelm that he had told him, number one. And number two, he had said from the very beginning, my contacts are confidential. I can only tell you the results, I can't tell you the methods. So my answer to the New York Slimes, as it would be to Admiral Horthy, Karl Renner, or any of the other sideshow freaks and idiots that did their best to ruin the man, you know what? Go look in the mirror and tell me what you see. No, not for you. You're fine.
One last. Okay.
Signore.
Yeah, you mentioned a little bit of speech, but I'm curious a bit more on the general public opinion of Carl and a lot of the practicing of Coulombe. You mentioned both like the Catholic opinion and also maybe the general opinion and like society.
Well, you mean now or then?
Now.
Well, there's an interesting thing. I'm glad you asked that question because there's a revolution going on in Habsburg studies. It's true. You see, as a result of the outcome of World War I and the birth of the new wonderful nations, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, etc., the mythos was born that Austria-Hungary was this tottering machine that was doomed to fail and would fall apart, and anyway, it was the prison of nations, and it was all evil and it was terrible. Well, no. And in fact, more and more and more historians, not just me, in English and in every language but German seemingly, are coming to the conclusion that, in fact, had it not been for the war, the old dog had a lot of life still left in it. Carl, as I say, would put him out in the end was Wilson's offer of starvation or overthrow. That was the choice he gave the peoples of Central Europe. Guess which one they went for. But there are sociologists today who look at the countries, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, that have part former Habsburg, part non-former Habsburg territories. And then from that, they've deduced what's called the Habsburg effect, which you'll see, I mean, in voting patterns, attitudes toward government, even levels of corruption. It almost follows the old borders. It's very peculiar. The other point I'll make in this area is that as we go along, and as I say, Central Europe has to re-examine its past in light of what's going on now, this is coming more and more and more to the fore. Just a totally anecdotal story, but it's worth mentioning. I have two classmates. One is both, young people. You know what they're like, they're young. But us old people know the difference. But you know what they call my color hair in Austria? Friedhofblond, graveyard blonde. That's, yeah, does he or doesn't he? Only his undertaker knows for sure. Okay. Anyway, so the thing was that I was invited to a thing called the Kaiserparade, the Kaiser Parade, in honor of the Archduke Karl's 60th birthday. He's the grandson of the Emperor Karl, the head of the house. So there were all these reenactment units, cavalry, artillery, infantry. It was quite an impressive show. And then I introduced them to the Archduke. We drove off back to our beautiful little town in Niederösterreich. As I say, the Slovak kid and the South Tyrolean, and remember South Tyrol's in Italy. They said to me, Uncle Charles, that's what they call me. Uncle Charles, we never realized this before, but we're actually countrymen. I said, yeah, you are. You are countrymen. And inheritors of a grand tradition, which you've just seen a touch of tonight, or today rather. And that, as with my response to this gentleman here, I can't help but think, partly for negative reasons, partly for positive, that something or other good will come out of Central Europe. And I am sure the illustrious House of Habsburg will have something to do with it, both in this world and the next. So, there you go.
Hey, two last questions real quick, Charles. So,
I don't know those people, and I was never there.
so like a lot of other saints, when Blessed Karl was near death, when the veil was thin, he had prophecies.
Yeah.
Now, I forget where I read this, but I think there was one concerning his daughter. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Or he's the unborn daughter.
Yeah, Elizabeth, the unborn
So
one.
I think there was, I wasn't sure if it was prophecy or not. I remember hearing that read somewhere. And then second, I forget where I read this also, but so are Zita, Empress Zita, and Emperor Karl, are their hearts buried together?
Yes.
What's the background behind that? That's a very
Well,
interesting.
that's a good question. Karl is entombed and enshrined, we have to say now, in the island of Madeira. We could go see him and also test the local Madeira wine. Zita, as I say, was given an imperial funeral, and she was buried in the Kaisergruft, the imperial crypt under the Kapuzinerkirche, the Capuchin church in Vienna. But she didn't know that was going to happen, and she had no intention of going to Madeira. So what to do? Well, the Habsburgs have an old custom that Franz Josef did away with. It's heart burial. The hearts were buried separately from the bodies. If you go to the Augustinerkirche in Vienna, you can see what's called the Herzgruft, the heart crypt. There you see all these urns with hearts. I don't open them. Well, no, don't. I wouldn't. But the monastery of Muri, you see, the Habsburgs originally came from Switzerland. And many years ago, centuries before they took over in Austria, the monastery of Muri was one of the churches where they were interred. So there were some old Habsburgs there. She was living in Switzerland, and so she had the bright idea of having her heart and his entombed there, and also of having that as a future shrine, future tombs for the family, because she had no idea that they'd ever be able to go back. So that's what happened. So if you go to Moray, you can see both the old Habsburgs and their hearts. As we know, not only was she put in the Kaiserkrone, so were most of her children, including Otto, who himself was laid to rest there when he died in 2011. But Otto's heart is not in the Kaiserkrone. You see, Otto, we barely touched on, but he was the greatest emperor Europe never had. He really was an amazing man, and he loved his people. He loved the Hungarians. They spoke Magyar fluently. One of the little tricks in their education Zita did was that the language of conversation every day would switch. One day it would be German, one day it would be Magyar, one day it would be Croat, one Italian, and so they became totally adept. So his heart is in the great abbey of Pannonhalma near Budapest, to show his heir to the Empire of Austria, but also to the Kingdom of Hungary. And you know, again, as I've said other venues other times, Central Europe in particular, and Europe as a whole, if you're a believing Catholic, they're like Sleeping Beauty's castle. You wonder what lips have to be kissed, what sword drawn from one's stone, what challenge uttered at what green night to wake it up. But please God, it will wake up. Anyway, so does that answer that?
Yes, wonderful, thank you.
All right. So, yes, sir.
Hey, great. Thank you so much for your talk. It was so insightful and fascinating. And my question is, Karl was very venerated in the Catholic Church, but he, only had 2 years on the throne, never really had a chance. And for the longest reigning monarch before him was Franz Joseph II.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, just curiously, what's his position within the Catholic Church? Is he also venerated? Because he was like the grandfather of the nation, of the most Catholic nation that remained in Europe, the most Catholic monarchy, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. And when he passed away in 1917, everyone said, or from books since written, that Austria was finished after that point because he was the defining person holding everything together. As great as Karl was, he wasn't Franz Joseph that everyone had known since ancient history as the emperor.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the same problem Edward VII had when he succeeded Victoria. She'd been queen since 1837 to 1901. And God help Prince Charles when Elizabeth dies. I mean, how many people here remember George VI? Yeah, exactly. So the answer is, it would have been a hard act to follow. But having said that, he was very well equipped to follow it. And, it's interesting that amongst the Episcopal appointments he made is another Beatus. I forget his first name, is Bishop Bosu in Romania, is a Romanian Catholic. I think, when you consider what he did manage to do in the short time he had, it's pretty extraordinary. He started, for instance, the first social welfare ministry in the history of the world, to organize the distribution of things that were, what do you call them, the war profiteers had a hold on stuff. So he worked very hard to break that. The ideas of federalizing the empire, all that sort of thing, new alliances, I think had it not been for the war, and also bear in mind he was very young, had Franz Ferdinand not died, number one, I think you would have seen Austria-Hungary transformed in a very positive way, both in terms of foreign affairs and internal things. And then, by the time he came to power, Franz Joseph, as I say, did not really care for Franz Ferdinand because of the morganatic thing, and he would do his best to keep him out of affairs. But Franz Ferdinand always said, when I am emperor, Karl will be right by my side every day. He needs, to learn. It is almost impossible to calculate what a horrible tragedy World War I really was on all sides for everybody. I mean, Portugal to Russia, Norway to Italy, and of course our own United States. We became the world center of finance as a result of that war. We went from being a debtor nation to being a creditor nation. The center of world finance went from the city of London to Wall Street. Now, that sounds great, And I don't know how much good it really did us in terms of our development as a country. You know, we went from being a kind of rough and tumble place to suddenly being the most powerful nation in the world. I don't know if Mr. Wilson did us a lot of good that way.
But Franz Joseph II, what's his position in the church?
Well, I mean, he was a great friend of the church, etc., but there's no cause for his, that I know of, for his beatification. Franz Joseph was very pious in his way, but, you know, let's put it this way, he didn't have the singleness of mind about his piety that Karl did. But I mean, if you go anywhere he lived, any of his palaces, he's got a very Spartan bedroom with a prie-dieu and a statue of Our Lady and so on. So I mean, he was certainly a believer. But if that was all it took, except for Joseph II, you'd be hard put to find a Habsburg you're looking at. And but the truth is, there were only Karl, Zita, and a nun who lived a couple hundred years before them. Despite their Pietas Austriaca and all that stuff. So, half a second, I'm right with you, sir. I saw your hand go up.
Yes, just very quickly, if you could talk a little bit, very briefly. Currently in politics, we kind of have this totem of multiculturalism, and it's kind of in a strange way forced down our throat. But you look to things like Austria, Coulombe, these great, strong kingdoms, empires, East and Central Europe, and there really truly was a multiculturalism in a very positive sense. Could you perhaps compare that true multiculturalism to the multiculturalism that we have now, this totem, this kind of pagan totem that we have? And also, if you could also talk about how the nation state perhaps plays in that.
Okay, very quickly, I haven't forgotten you, sir. Unless you thought that my mind was wandering. It often does. Well, first and foremost, those nations to which you refer were bound by certain intangibilities. The altar and the throne, the Catholic faith, and the dynasty. And in truth, even those countries we think of as nation states were not. France, Spain, Portugal, these weren't nation states. They were collections just like Central Europe. The only difference is that they were a little closer linguistically. But each of them were the creation of their monarchs. It's interesting, I'm French Canadian, as I love to trumpet constantly in case people forget in 5 minutes. But our French is affected by the fact that our mothers, so to speak, the first wave of women, were called filles du roi, daughters of the king. They were raised in royal orphanages, and they were raised to speak the French of the court, even if they were from Provence. And then, as a result, it had a huge effect on the way Canadian French is. It's much more, I mean, very, very few people spoke French in the sense that we think of it as throughout France in 1615. Very few people. But 50 years later in Quebec, the vast majority did. You see, and that, again, France was the creation of its kings, the same as Portugal. But again, the altar and the throne were intangibilities. So you ask, what's the difference? Well, the difference is we really had the Catholic faith and we really had the monarchy. Those are real. Our multiculturalism really isn't based in anything in particular, except it's nice to be multicultural, which, don't get me wrong, you know, my father was French Canadian, my mother was Austrian and English. I live in a Spanish-speaking town. Well, I did. Now I live in Germany or in Austria, wherever. The point I'm making is I'm all for being multiculti, as they say. But to work effectively, it has to have a unifying force to balance the divisiveness. And that is what modern multiculturalism lacks. And you see, it can't just be a negative like the pursuit of freedom. It's got to be something positive. You cannot do anything just to set of negatives. And that's also true for Union and Central Europe, just so I thought that in there. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Wasn't Karl have any devotion within the Eastern rites of the church besides the Western rite? Is there like kind of the same level of devotion? Is it more or less about the same?
Excellent question. The answer is yes, he does have some. I mean, there are icons of it. And you've got to remember too, I mentioned that Bishop Bosu, who's a Romanian, Catholic Beatus was appointed by him. Yeah, so the answer is yes. And there are several of the shrines, I think 2 or 3 at least, to him in the United States are in Eastern Rite churches. You can find a list of them if you go to the blessedcharles.org website. So not that we're making a push for it. The other thing too, there's an icon that you'll see online, which I find very interesting. It shows Blessed Emperor Karl in the garb of a Holy Roman Emperor. Now, of course, he was not. He was the Emperor of Austria. And yet, there's a sort of poetic or even spiritual sense in which that is true. He was, in that sense, the last emperor of Europe. And it's interesting, you know, when my grandfather was born in 1890, there were, I forget, 11, 12, 13 emperors in the world. My father was born in 1926. There were 4. When I was born, there were 3. And now there's 1. Bonus points if you can tell me who's the 1 emperor. Yes, sir. Right, Japan. Very good. Give that man sukiyaki or whatever. But that, no, seriously, that's an important thing. Anybody guess who the other 2 emperors were? Only 1 was Christian. What's that?
One of them, Haile Selassie.
Yes, Ethiopia.
Yeah.
And the other was the Shah. The Shah of Iran. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Can I just ask you, a number of years ago, Matteo Salvini, you ordered the crucifixes back in the schools. And then there was a bishop in the Vatican who objected, saying that was harsh. So if the emperor represents the unity of faith and culture, and we have a total decoupling of that now, where people want culture but they don't want the faith,
Yeah.
how do we restore that?
Well, of course, that is a very hard question to ask. It's easy to wreck, not so hard to reconstruct. But the answer is wherever you are. And I mean, look around you. Look at whatever local stuff is going on. I mean, remember, the vast majority of us in this room do not rule countries or even governors or mayors. But wherever you are, whatever sphere of influence you have, you can try on your own level. And if you see any larger initiatives, give them your backing. I don't want to make an ad, but there is a drive to restore this church.
There is, isn't there?
Just thought I'd mention that. It begins at home.
Saints Shrine needs an altar cloth. Who changes his mind?
No. Oh, now everyone's smiling. No, the one point though I would make, Father, if you will look in to see what the Habsburg connection is, if any, with this church, you let me know and I will publicize it. Of course.
We'll be the number 19.
But I was going to say, you may have to start looking into setting up a Kaiser Karl shrine here.
Yeah.
In the Big Apple.
If there is a connection, it's most appropriate.
It really is, absolutely.
Yeah, we have to do it in time.
So, have a look.
It'd be wrong not to.
All right, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Let me ask you a question. When Karl was suffering on his deathbed, reading too much into it, you think that he was like a victim soul when he was literally suffering for people?
I'm going to have to ask you to say that one more time louder because the old deaf guy has problems.
When Emperor Karl was suffering on his deathbed, do you think that was literal? He was literally suffering for his people like a victim soul would be?
Yes,
Yeah.
certainly he felt he was. And he was in a better position to judge his case than I am. But yes, I think he was a victim soul for the peoples of Central Europe, for his peoples. And again, I cannot imagine being ruled by a man like that. I mean, I know intellectually what it's like, but to be ruled by someone who gave a damn whether I lived or died, much less went to heaven or hell, I can't even imagine what that would be like.
That's it. Thank you, Mr. Coulombe. Thank you.